There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels full. Heavy with something you can't name, something pressing against the edges of your attention, something that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise even when the air is still and the sky is calm and there is no visible reason to feel afraid. Most of us have learned to dismiss that feeling. We call it nerves. We call it overthinking. We keep moving because stopping seems like weakness, because the world around us looks ordinary enough, because nothing has actually gone wrong yet. But sometimes, before the wrong thing happens, something else happens first. Something quieter. A signal that arrives not in words but in the language of instinct, in a gesture you almost miss, in a detail so small it barely registers until the moment it becomes the only thing that matters. This is a story about that kind of signal. And it begins the way most important things begin. Quietly, and without warning. His name was Daniel Voss, and he had been writing since before he could remember. There are people for whom certain things are simply inherited rather than chosen. Not in the genetic sense, not in the way of eye color or the shape of a nose, but in a deeper and stranger way. The way a child absorbs the emotional logic of a household and carries it forward into their own life without ever consciously deciding to. Daniel had not decided to love horses. He had simply grown up in the presence of them and found, somewhere along the way, that he could not imagine being himself without that presence. Not competitively, not professionally. He rode the way some men fish or walk or sit with old books. It was simply something he had always done, something that belonged to him the way certain memories belong to a person without any clear reason why. His father had put him on a horse at the age of 4 on a cold morning in the lower valley, and Daniel could still recall the sensation of being that high off the ground, the world suddenly rearranged from that new vantage point. It had felt like being let into a secret, like being shown something most people never got to see. He was 36 now. He worked remotely, managing supply chain data for a logistics company he would never visit in person, and he lived alone on a small property at the edge of the hill country, 20 minutes from the nearest town and 15 from the nearest neighbor. He liked the distance. He liked the sound of wind through the cedar trees in the morning. He liked that nobody came looking for him and he had no reason to explain himself to anyone. He had a dog named Sal who was mostly border collie and entirely useless, and he had a horse named Pell who was a gray mare of 12 years, and who had been his for nearly 7 of them. He had bought Pell from a woman named Marin who had raised her from a foal and who had spent a long time looking at Daniel before she agreed to sell her. Not inspecting him in any obvious or dramatic way. Just looking, the way someone looks when they're trying to read a quality of character that can't be summarized. They had stood together at the pasture fence in the late afternoon and Pell had come over without being called, and had stood with her chin resting on the top rail and her dark eyes moving between them, and after a while the woman had said, quietly, that she thought it would be all right. Daniel had taken that seriously. He still did. Pell was not a complicated horse. She was not dramatic or difficult or prone to the sudden starts and bolts that some horses carried into middle age like old anxieties. She was steady, attentive, responsive to small signals. She had a way of leaning into the reins that felt like a conversation rather than a command. Daniel trusted her the way you trust something that has never given you reason not to. Thoroughly, and without much thought. The way you trust the ground beneath your feet. It was a Tuesday in early October when he first noticed it. The month had arrived the way October sometimes did in that part of the country, not with the dramatic temperature breaks of more northern climates but with a slow, soft dimming. The light changed before the temperature did. It went from the flat, relentless white of late summer to something more angled, more golden, more aware of its own transience. The shadows grew longer and more definite. The cedar trees looked darker. The dry grass in the south pasture had gone the color of old wheat, and in the mornings there was a quality to the air that felt like something held just before the moment of release. He had taken the Easter route. It was his least used path, cutting along the ridge above the dry creek bed and looping back through a section of mixed brush and cedar that opened eventually onto a wide flat pasture. The air that morning had a particular quality, the kind that sits low and cool and smells faintly of limestone and old grass. A good morning for riding. A morning where nothing feels urgent in the world contracts pleasantly to the dimensions of your own small movement through it. They had been out for perhaps 40 minutes when Pell's ears turned back. Not an alarm. More in the way of listening, as if adjusting a dial, tuning towards something Daniel couldn't detect. He noticed it, registered it, let it pass. Horses were sensitive to things he couldn't perceive. Wind shifts, the sounds of distant animals, subsonic vibrations in the ground that only they could feel. He gave it no more thought than he would give to a gust of wind. But then she did it again. Not just her ears this time. Her whole head tilted, subtly, and her attention dragged in a direction that was not the path in front of them but the space behind and to the left. She wasn't alarmed. She wasn't pulling or dancing or showing any of the signs he associated with genuine fear. She was simply looking. Attentively and repeatedly, the way a person looks when they're almost certain they've heard their name. Daniel glanced back. Nothing moved. The brush was still. The light was flat and gray and early. He turned forward and they kept moving. The third time it happened, something shifted in him. Not alarm, exactly. More like the cognitive version of a stumble. A small interruption in the flow of ordinary thought. He noticed himself noticing her, which was different from simply seeing her, and that difference mattered, though he couldn't have explained why. They had covered another half-mile before he found himself paying closer attention. Not watching the trail ahead with the casual peripheral awareness of long habit, but actively observing her. The way her neck moved. The angle of her head. The moments when her ears stopped tracking the ambient sounds of the world and fixed on something specific and unchanging. Something in that direction, the same direction every time, slightly behind and to the left. It was consistent. That was the part that got to him. Animals reacted to things. Birds, smells, sudden sounds, the irregular grammar of a living landscape. But those reactions moved around. They shifted with whatever stimulus provoked them. This was different. This was the same place. Over and over. She was returning to something. Not reacting to something new, but checking on something already found. Something that kept pulling her focus back the way a person returns again and again to a sound they heard in another room. He found himself thinking about horses and their senses. What they could perceive that he couldn't. Their hearing range wider than his. Their eyesight covering nearly a full 360 degrees, monocular and precise. Their sensitivity to ground vibration, to barometric shifts, to the presence and movement of animals at distances that would seem impossible if you hadn't encountered it yourself. They were wired differently. Not better or worse than a human nervous system, but shaped for a different relationship with the world. One built more around survival, more around the perpetual low-level management of risk. He had read somewhere that horses had been observed detecting seismic activity before humans could register it. That they responded to impending weather changes long before any visible sign appeared. That their capacity for spatial memory was extraordinary. A horse that had walked a trail once could recall specific features of it years later. A particular rock formation, a change in terrain, a place where the footing had been uncertain. That last thought stayed with him. A place where the footing had been uncertain. He had not ridden this eastern route in several months. Not since late spring, before the summer dry season had done whatever it had done to the land. And the land in that part of the country was not static. Erosion worked quietly and persistently. Rain carved channels that hadn't been there before. Limestone shelving shifted. The edges of things could change between visits. He wasn't afraid yet. but he was paying attention in a different way than he had been 10 minutes ago. And Pell had shifted again, her head tilting back into the left, her ears set in that direction like small antennae, and then she pulled, slightly, barely perceptible, not a bolt or a spook but a suggestion, a gentle resistance, the equine equivalent of someone placing a hand on your arm to slow you down. Daniel pulled the reins himself. He brought her to a stop. She settled immediately, which was not the behavior of a spooked horse. A spooked horse didn't relax when it stopped. A spooked horse needed to move, needed the relief of distance. She didn't. She stopped and stood, and the only thing different was that her head was still turned toward that direction, still engaged with whatever it was that was there. He sat with her for a moment in the quiet. The morning had that muffled quality that some mornings have, where the usual ambient sounds seemed to have retreated. No birds. The wind had dropped. He could hear his own breath, and hers, slow and even, and beneath that, nothing. He turned in the saddle. Properly this time, not a glance but a full rotation, bringing himself around to face the direction she had been watching for the last mile and a half. The terrain behind them was uneven. He had not paid close attention to it on the way through because his attention had been forward, as it usually was, as it reasonably was on a familiar route. The brush to the left of the trail was dense enough to make the ground behind it difficult to read from horseback. The cedar trees grew close there, and their lower branches swept low and created visual interference, the kind that turns space into an impression rather than a clear image. He took his foot from the stirrup and considered dismounting. He did not, in the end. Instead, he stood in the saddle, lifting himself to gain the few extra inches of elevation, and looked. At first, he saw nothing specific. The usual textures of the landscape, amber and gray in the dull green of cedar, the pale limestone showing through the thin soil and patches. His eyes moved the way they do when you're looking for something without knowing exactly what, scanning for something wrong in the composition of ordinary things. And then he found it. It was the shadow that told him. A shadow that fell at an angle that didn't match the surrounding terrain, that suggested a vertical drop where the ground had appeared horizontal. He nearly missed it even then. The angle of the morning light was low enough to flatten things, to compress the apparent depth of the landscape into something deceivingly even. But the shadow was there. And once his eyes had found it, he could see the rest. The ground at the edge of the trail, 3 or 4 yards to the left of where they had just passed, dropped away. Not gradually, the way slopes usually did in that country. It dropped steeply, the kind of fall that happened when the limestone underneath gave way and took the soil with it, leaving an abrupt shelf that erosion had been carving quietly over the course of a season or more. It was maybe 15 feet deep. Maybe more. The bottom was boulder-strewn and edged with the kind of angular limestone that didn't break falls so much as receive them. Daniel stood in the saddle for a long moment and looked at it. He did the arithmetic that you do when something like that reveals itself. Working out the geometry of near misses, the small distances and timing changes that would have changed the outcome. If he had taken the normal pace he usually kept on this stretch. If Pell had not been pulling him slightly, subtly, just enough degrees to the right to move them a little further from that edge. If the light had come from a different angle and the shadow had not been there to catch his eye when he finally looked. He felt something settle through him that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite relief. A sort of reckoning. The particular weight of understanding how close things can come to being different. He lowered himself back into the saddle. He sat with her for another minute, neither of them moving, the morning standing very still around them. Then he reached forward and laid his hand along the side of her neck, just below the mane, in the way he had done 10,000 times. She didn't react visibly, but he felt the shift in her breathing beneath his palm, the slight easing of something that had been held. She had known. He couldn't have said how, couldn't have named the exact mechanism by which she had perceived it before he had. Whether she had seen the shadow on some earlier pass through this trail and stored the information, or whether she had heard something in the sound of the ground, the difference between solid footing in the hollow resonance of compromised limestone, or whether it was something else entirely, something he had no name for. He didn't need to know exactly. He had been around horses long enough to understand that some of their knowing was not the kind that translated into human categories. What he understood was simpler and more important. She had been trying to tell him something for a mile and a half. He had been listening to himself, to his own assumptions, to the comfort of the familiar route, to the reasonable explanations he kept reaching for: bird sounds, wind shifts, the ambient stimulus of a living landscape. He had been doing what people do when something quiet tries to interrupt a louder certainty. He had been explaining it away. And if you're still here with this story, if something in it has stayed close to you, maybe you already know what that feels like. To have a signal arrive quietly and wait, patient and persistent, while you find reasons to keep moving. You can leave a like if this found you. Or stay a little longer. Daniel rode home a different way. Not out of superstition, not out of a need to avoid the Eastern Trail, but because he wanted to approach the property from the north that morning, to see it from an angle he didn't usually see it from. He had been living here for 4 years, and he realized, sitting on Pell in the thin October light with the shock of near distance still humming in his chest, that he had stopped really seeing it. Had stopped noticing the details. Had been moving through a place he knew too well to actually look at anymore. The north approach took him through a section of old grassland that had not been grazed in years and had grown back into something wilder than pasture, something that felt transitional and unfinished and full of its own quiet life. Hawks worked the updrafts above the ridge. A scissortail perched on the fence wire and watched them pass with the enormous nonchalance of small birds who have decided that horses are not worth concerning themselves with. He let Pell set the pace. She walked slowly, and he let her, and he looked at things. He thought about his father, who had died 3 winters ago, quietly and quickly and far enough from Daniel that Daniel had not made it in time. He thought about the last long conversation they had had, which had been on the phone in November, and which had been about nothing in particular, just the ordinary passing of information between a father and a son who had long ago stopped knowing quite how to talk to each other. He thought about how he had hung up that evening with the sense that there was still something left to say, and how he had assumed there would be time to say it, because that was the assumption everyone made until suddenly there was no more time and the thing remained unsaid and became instead a permanent feature of the interior landscape, a kind of hollow in the chest you learned to carry without calling attention to it. His father had taught him to ride. Had told him, more than once, to trust the horse more than his own instincts, because horses didn't edit themselves, didn't filter their perceptions through ego or assumption or the need to appear competent. They just responded to what was actually there. He had not thought about those words in years. He thought about them now. The property came into view ahead of him, the house low and pale in the morning light, the live oaks standing around it in the unhurried way they always had. Sal appeared at the far fence line, having detected their approach well before a normal dog would have, and began to drift in their direction with the studied casualness of a dog who did not want to appear too eager but absolutely was. Daniel slowed Pell to a stop at the gate and sat for a moment before going in. There was a particular quality to the world from the back of a horse. Something about the elevation and the pace and the way the animal's movement connected you physically to the ground beneath you. You felt things differently up there. The land wasn't just something you moved across. It moved with you, communicated with you, through hoofbeats and footing and the slight adjustments of balance that a horse made 100 times a minute and that you felt in your own body as a kind of ongoing conversation. He thought about what he might have done differently. What he might have paid attention to sooner. How much of that last mile and a half he had spent explaining away what was right in front of him. He thought it was probably not the only time he had done that. Not the only time an important thing had been there, patient and persistent, and he had talked himself past it. He would not say he had any kind of revelation in the field that morning. Revelations were dramatic. What he had was quieter than that. More like the slow adjusting of something that had been slightly miscalibrated. A lens he had been looking through without realizing it was slightly off, and now, after the morning's cold arithmetic, it had been corrected. He opened the gate and rode through. That afternoon he called his older sister, which he had not done in 4 months. They talked for an hour and a half about nothing in particular, about her kids and his property in a television program they had both apparently been watching without knowing the other watched it, and somewhere in the middle of it he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the sense of not being alone with himself, of being known by someone who had known him before he was who he was now, and who would continue knowing him regardless. He didn't mention the morning. He didn't mention the drop in the limestone, the shadow that had told him what it was, the mare who had been trying to tell him longer than he had been willing to listen. He didn't need to. It wasn't a story yet. It was just something that had happened, something quiet and close, something he was still inside. There are moments in a life that don't announce themselves as important. They don't come with changed light or swelling music or the sense that the world has paused to mark what has just occurred. They come the way that morning had come. Ordinarily, just an ordinary Tuesday with an ordinary route that had stopped being ordinary in the middle of it and then gradually resumed its appearance of normalcy. You could ride past the shelter of an ordinary morning and only realize much later what had been standing inside it, waiting for you to look closely enough. He thought about that on the ride home. He thought about all the things that happened inside the ordinary, the things that hid in plain sight because they wore the colors of the everyday. How much of what mattered in a life existed in that register, beneath the threshold of what we thought of as significant. Not the marked occasions, the births and deaths and decisions you made with full awareness of their weight, but the smaller calibrations. The moments that quietly shifted something. The signals you almost missed. He let Pell out into the south pasture at dusk. She moved away from the gate at the steady, certain walk she always used in the evenings, heading for the dry grass along the far fence where she liked to stand while the light changed. He leaned on the gate and watched her until the light dropped below the ridge and the pasture went to shadow and she was just a shape moving slowly through the gray. He noticed he was still watching, even when he could barely see her. He noticed he wasn't in a hurry to go inside. He thought about the woman who had sold her to him. Marin, with her long look and her slow verdict in the way she had said, quietly, that she thought it would be all right. He wondered sometimes if she had known something that he hadn't known yet. Something about the particular kind of person who needed the particular kind of horse that Pell was. Or maybe that was giving it too much shape. Maybe it had simply been the ordinary intuition of someone who knew horses well enough to read the spaces between things. The silences. The posture of wanting. He had not spoken to her since the day he drove away with Pell in the trailer. He thought sometimes that he should write to her. Tell her that it had been all right. Tell her it had been considerably more than all right. But he had not done it, and now 7 years had accumulated between the impulse and the act, and it had begun to feel like too much time had passed, as if the moment for that particular communication had closed. He stood at the gate a while longer. The first star appeared to the east. Then another. The sky began its slow shift from the washed blue of late dusk into something deeper and more ancient, the stars taking their places one by one like an audience settling in before something begins. Inside, Sal had put himself in front of the wood stove, which was not lit, but which was apparently warm enough in memory to be worth claiming. He opened one eye when Daniel came in, assessed the situation, and closed it again. Daniel made coffee he didn't particularly need and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the pasture where he could no longer see Pell but knew where she was, knew her particular corner of the fence, knew the way she stood in the evening, weight shifted slightly to one hip, the gray of her coat going almost silver in the last of the light. He thought about his father again. He kept coming back to that. The way grief worked sometimes, circling back to the same material, the same scenes, the same half-finished conversations that had become permanent now in their incompleteness. His father had been a man of few and careful words. He had not been demonstrative, had not been the kind of man who said what he felt without being asked, and sometimes not even then. Daniel had spent a long time in his 20s being frustrated by that, wanting something that wasn't being offered. A particular kind of direct acknowledgement that his father either could not or did not know how to give. When he understood now, standing in his kitchen in the October dark with the coffee going cold in his hand, was that his father had been showing him things his whole life. Not saying them, showing them. The morning he had put him on a horse for the first time, the patience with which he had held the lead rope and walked alongside, not rushing, not instructing, just present. The way he would stop during a ride and say nothing and simply sit on his horse and look at the land around them as if it were enough just to be in the presence of something beautiful. The way he had taught Daniel to read terrain, not by explaining the theory of it but by asking him, quietly and repeatedly, what he saw, what he noticed, what he thought the ground was telling him. Trust what you can perceive, his father had said once, and trust what the horse perceives. Between the two of you, you can usually see enough. He had not understood that at 15. He was beginning to understand it now. In the weeks that followed, he rode the eastern route several times. He marked the edge of the shelf with a cairn of stones, not because he needed the reminder but because it seemed right. Something that important should be visible, should be given a shape in the world. He repaired a section of fencing he had known needed repairing for almost a year and had been putting off for reasons he couldn't anymore recall. He called the local vet for Pell's winter check earlier than he usually did. He called his sister twice more. He sat with Sal more often in the evenings, doing nothing in particular, just being in the same space, which Sal seemed to find deeply satisfying. He paid attention differently. He wouldn't have said it was a dramatic change. It was barely a change at all, from the outside. He went to work at the same hours, ate the same things, followed roughly the same patterns he had always followed. But there was something recalibrated underneath all of it. A shift in what he chose to listen to. He thought about that again and again, in the quiet way that important things come back to you. How the signal had been there the whole time. Patient and consistent and not going anywhere. How it had waited for him to stop explaining and simply turn around. He thought about how many times the important things in his life had arrived like that. Quietly. Repeatedly. Without drama or announcement. Just there, tugging gently at the edge of his attention, waiting for the moment when he finally got still enough to notice. He didn't know if that was a lesson. He wasn't sure it needed to be one. Some mornings, riding out early while the light was still low and the air still smelled of limestone and cold grass, he felt something that might have been gratitude. For the route, for the morning, for the horse moving steadily beneath him. For the particular October Tuesday that had asked him to stop and look. For the patient, gray-bodied thing that had known before he did, and had waited, and had not given up on making him understand. He thought about his father. He thought about all the things that wait for us, out there in the terrain we think we know. The edges we don't see because we are not looking in the right direction. The signals that arrive quietly and repeat themselves and go on repeating, patient beyond what patience usually means, waiting for the moment when we finally get still enough to receive them. He thought about how much of a life was spent in motion, moving from one known thing to the next, comfortable in the familiar shape of the days, and how rarely we stopped and turned around and looked at what had been trying to reach us. He thought about the things he had not said to his father. He thought about the things his father had not said to him. He thought about how those unsaid things had not disappeared. They were still there, held in the shape of what had been said instead, in the morning rides, in the pointed silences, in the way his father had stood at a pasture fence and looked at the world as if looking were itself a form of love. Maybe it was. He thought about the mare in the pasture. 12 years old and gray and steady, and possessed of a knowing that had no name in any language he had access to. He felt grateful for her in a way that surprised him with its depth. Not the usual gratitude of attachment, not the particular tenderness of a man for an animal he was fond of, but something more structural. A gratitude for what she represented. For the fact that the world contained things that perceived differently than he did and were willing, if he was willing to pay attention, to share what they perceived. He rode slowly. He paid attention. He let the horse lead him sometimes, when she seemed certain about something and he was not. And on those mornings when the light dropped at just the right angle, when the world went quiet and the land fell into long blue shadows, he turned in the saddle and looked back. Not out of fear. Not out of habit. Just to make sure he wasn't missing something. Hell always seemed to understand those moments. She would slow without being asked, almost imperceptibly, giving him the time. That was enough. That had always been enough. It had just taken him a while to know it. If this story found something in you, something quiet that was already there, you can leave a like or share a thought below. And if you'd like to return to stories like this one, slow and still and told close to the bone, you can subscribe, and we'll be here when you're ready to listen again.